At 9:47 in the morning on June 4, 1942, Commander Joseph Rochefort stood in the basement of the 14th Naval District headquarters at Pearl Harbor, watching a map of the Pacific Ocean that showed the position of every American warship within 1,000 miles of Midway Atoll. He had not slept in 36 hours. His eyes burned from staring at decoded Japanese messages. His hands shook slightly from too much coffee and not enough food. But none of that mattered now. In approximately 90 minutes, American dive bombers would either find the Japanese carrier fleet or run out of fuel trying. If they found it, the United States had a chance. If they did not, Japan would control the Pacific for the next decade. Rochefort had spent 6 months breaking Japanese naval codes. He knew where the enemy fleet was heading. He knew when they would arrive. He knew the composition of their forces: 4 heavy carriers, 2 light carriers, 7 battleships, 15 cruisers, 42 destroyers. He knew all of this because he and his team had penetrated the Japanese naval code JN-25B. But knowledge meant nothing if American pilots could not turn that intelligence into action. The Japanese did not believe Americans were capable of this level of warfare. Japanese admirals had been saying it for months. Americans were soft. Americans lacked discipline. Americans could not match Japanese pilot skill or Japanese tactical brilliance. The attack on Pearl Harbor had proven Japanese superiority. Every battle since then had reinforced it. Hong Kong fell in 18 days. Singapore fell in 70 days. The Philippines fell in 5 months. American forces retreated everywhere the Japanese advanced. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto had spent years in the United States. He studied at Harvard University from 1919 to 1921. He served as naval attaché in Washington from 1926 to 1928. He understood American industrial capacity better than most Japanese officers, but even Yamamoto had developed what he later described as a low opinion of American naval officers during his time in America. He considered them less professional than their Japanese counterparts, less dedicated to the art of war, more concerned with comfort than victory. This attitude shaped Japanese war planning. When Yamamoto designed the attack on Pearl Harbor, he assumed American carriers would be in port because Americans followed predictable peacetime routines. When he planned the Midway operation, he assumed American forces would react slowly and conventionally because that was how Americans had always fought. He dispersed his fleet across millions of square miles of ocean because he believed Americans lacked the intelligence capability to detect his forces until it was too late. The first American officer killed by Japanese underestimation was First Lieutenant George Cannon. On December 7, 1941, approximately 14 hours after the Pearl Harbor attack, Japanese destroyers Sazanami and Ushio bombarded Midway Atoll. The attack came at night. At 21:31 local time, shells began falling on Sand Island. Cannon commanded Battery H, responsible for defending the southern approach to the airfield. A Japanese shell struck his command post. The explosion shattered his left leg below the knee and drove shrapnel through his abdomen and chest. His men tried to evacuate him to the aid station. Cannon refused. He remained at his post, directing fire against the Japanese destroyers for another 40 minutes, even as he bled from multiple wounds. His battery scored hits on both destroyers, forcing them to withdraw. By the time medical personnel reached him, Cannon had lost consciousness from blood loss. He died shortly after midnight. He was 26 years old. He became the first Marine to receive the Medal of Honor in the Second World War. The official report stated that Cannon had died heroically defending Midway. What the report did not mention was that the Japanese attack had been executed with casual confidence. The destroyers approached Midway without air cover, without proper reconnaissance, and without battleship support. They assumed American defenses would be minimal and American responses would be slow. They were wrong. Cannon's battery, despite being outgunned, fought back effectively. Multiple hits forced both destroyers to retreat earlier than planned. The Japanese had underestimated American resolve, but Cannon was still dead. This pattern would repeat across the Pacific for the next 6 months. Japanese forces achieved victory after victory, but each victory cost more than Tokyo admitted. The conquests looked impressive on maps: Hong Kong, Manila, Singapore, Bataan, Corregidor. But the defenders fought harder than Japanese planners expected. American Marines at Wake Island held out for 15 days against overwhelming odds. Filipino and American troops on Bataan fought for 3 months before surrendering. The British garrison at Singapore, though ultimately defeated, inflicted significant casualties. These were not the easy victories that Japanese pre-war planning had anticipated. Admiral Nimitz understood this. From his headquarters at Pearl Harbor, Nimitz watched Japanese expansion with concern but not panic. He recognized that Japan had achieved tactical victories, but not strategic dominance. Japanese supply lines were overextended. Japanese forces were dispersed across thousands of miles of ocean. Japanese naval aviation, though formidable, was not invincible. Most importantly, Nimitz had something Yamamoto did not have. He had code breakers. Commander Joseph Rochefort had been breaking codes for the U.S. Navy since the 1920s. He was not a typical naval officer. Born in Dayton, Ohio in 1900, Rochefort had enlisted in the Navy during the First World War without finishing high school. He earned his commission through the Wartime Officer Training Program and discovered he had an aptitude for intelligence work. The Navy sent him to Japan for 3 years of language training in the late 1920s. He returned to Japan in the early 1930s for advanced studies. By 1941, Rochefort was one of perhaps a dozen American officers who combined fluency in Japanese, deep understanding of Japanese culture, and expertise in cryptanalysis. The Navy assigned Rochefort to Station Hypo in early 1941. Station Hypo was the radio intelligence unit at Pearl Harbor, located in the basement of the 14th Naval District headquarters. The workspace was cramped, poorly ventilated, and perpetually cold to protect the IBM tabulating machines used for code analysis. Rochefort's staff consisted of about 40 people: cryptanalysts, Japanese language specialists, radio operators, and clerks. Most were reservists or enlisted men. Some were musicians from the battleship California's band. Rochefort had recruited them specifically because he believed their ability to read and interpret sheet music would translate to pattern recognition in code breaking. He was right. Breaking the Japanese naval code JN-25B was extraordinarily difficult. The system used 5-digit code groups, each representing a word, phrase, or concept. These code groups were then encrypted using additive tables that changed periodically. Without the additive tables, the code groups were meaningless. Without understanding the context and cultural references, even decrypted messages were difficult to interpret. Before Pearl Harbor, Station Hypo could read perhaps 10 to 15% of intercepted Japanese naval traffic. That was not enough to provide tactical warning of attacks. After Pearl Harbor, everything changed. The stakes were existential. Rochefort and his team worked around the clock. They slept in shifts, ate at their desks, and rarely saw daylight. Rochefort himself adopted an unusual uniform for these marathon sessions, a red smoking jacket and carpet slippers. His staff thought he was eccentric. His superiors in Washington thought he was insubordinate. Rochefort did not care about either opinion. He cared about breaking codes and saving American lives. By April 1942, Station Hypo was reading perhaps 40% of Japanese naval traffic. This was enough to detect patterns and identify preparations for major operations. In early May, Rochefort began noticing unusual activity. Multiple intercepts referenced an operation scheduled for early June. The target was designated AF. The operation involved substantial forces: multiple carrier divisions, battleship formations, cruiser squadrons, and an invasion group. This was not a raid or a probing attack. This was a major offensive. Rochefort analyzed every reference to AF in the intercepted traffic. Previous messages had used the letter A to designate locations in the Central Pacific. The F component appeared to match geographic coordinates for Midway Atoll. Additional clues supported this conclusion. A Japanese reconnaissance flight had reported weather conditions at AF. The weather report matched known conditions at Midway. References to landing forces and airbase construction suggested an amphibious invasion. Everything pointed to Midway, but Washington disagreed. Captain John Redman, who directed the Navy's Code and Signals section in Washington, believed AF referred to the Aleutian Islands, or possibly the West Coast. Other analysts suggested Port Moresby, or even Hawaii itself. Admiral Ernest King, who commanded the entire U.S. Navy, was receiving conflicting intelligence assessments. Some said Midway, some said Alaska, some said the South Pacific. King needed certainty. So did Admiral Nimitz. Nimitz had 3 aircraft carriers available in the Pacific: Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown. The Japanese had at least 6 carriers, possibly 8. If Nimitz concentrated his forces at Midway and the attack came somewhere else, the real target would be undefended. If Nimitz dispersed his forces to cover multiple locations, they would be defeated in detail when the Japanese struck in strength. Nimitz had to guess correctly. One wrong guess would lose the war. Rochefort needed proof. He needed to force the Japanese to confirm that AF was Midway. On May 19, 1942, Rochefort proposed a deception operation to Lieutenant Commander Edwin Layton, who served as Admiral Nimitz's intelligence officer. Layton and Rochefort had served together during their language training in Japan. They trusted each other professionally and personally. Layton understood immediately what Rochefort was proposing. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Midway would broadcast an unencrypted radio message reporting equipment failure. Specifically, the message would state that the water distillation plant had suffered a serious malfunction and that the garrison was running low on fresh water. If Japanese radio intelligence stations intercepted this message and reported it to fleet headquarters using the supposedly secure JN25B code, and if Station Hypo intercepted and decrypted those Japanese reports, then the Japanese messages should mention that AF was short of water. That would prove definitively that AF was Midway. The plan had risks. If the Japanese suspected deception, they might change their codes immediately. Station Hypo would lose its window into Japanese planning. If the Japanese simply ignored the message, the ruse would fail to provide proof. If Washington still refused to believe Rochefort, even with confirming evidence, the entire exercise would be pointless. But the alternative was worse. Without proof, the disagreement between Rochefort and Washington would continue, and Nimitz would have to make his decision based on competing analyses rather than confirmed intelligence. Rochefort presented the plan to Layton on May 19. Layton took it to Nimitz that afternoon. Nimitz approved it immediately. Instructions went out to Midway, via secure submarine cable, on May 20th. The orders were specific. Midway would broadcast a message in plain English, stating that the water distillation system had broken down and that emergency water supplies were needed. The message should sound routine and administrative, not urgent enough to suggest strategic importance. On May 22nd, Midway transmitted the message. The water distillation plant has suffered a serious malfunction. We have fresh water reserves for approximately 2 weeks. Request resupply at earliest opportunity. The message was broadcast on standard frequencies in unencrypted form. Japanese radio intelligence stations in the Marshall Islands intercepted it within hours. Station Hypo monitored Japanese radio traffic continuously. Within 48 hours, they intercepted a Japanese message, encrypted in JN25B. The message was from a Japanese intelligence unit to Combined Fleet Headquarters. When decrypted, the message stated that aerial reconnaissance had confirmed AF as an objective and that AF was reporting a shortage of fresh water. The message recommended that the invasion force bring additional water desalination equipment to support operations after the landing. Rochefort brought the decrypt to Nimitz on May 24th. The evidence was conclusive. AF was Midway. The Japanese had confirmed it themselves. Nimitz now had the intelligence he needed to make his decision. He would concentrate all 3 available carriers northeast of Midway. They would wait in ambush. When the Japanese struck, American forces would counterattack. The person who originally suggested the water shortage deception was Lieutenant Commander Wilfred J. Jasper Holmes, a member of Rochefort's staff who went by the name Jasper. Nimitz faced a logistics problem. The carrier Yorktown had been severely damaged at the Battle of the Coral Sea 2 weeks earlier. 3 bomb hits had penetrated the flight deck. Fires had damaged interior spaces. The steering gear had been affected. Navy engineers at Pearl Harbor estimated that repairs would require 90 days in a major shipyard. Nimitz told them they had 72 hours. 1,400 workers from Pearl Harbor Naval Shipyard descended on Yorktown when she limped into port on May 27th. They worked in continuous shifts, 24 hours per day. Damage control teams cut away twisted steel. Welders installed new deck plates. Electricians rewired damaged systems. Shipfitters patched hull breaches. Carpenters rebuilt destroyed spaces. The work continued without pause. Yorktown departed Pearl Harbor on May 30th, with some repair crews still aboard, planning to complete work at sea. Enterprise and Hornet had departed 2 days earlier. All three carriers rendezvoused at a position designated Point Luck on June 2nd. Point Luck was located 325 miles northeast of Midway. The position had been carefully chosen. It was close enough to Midway to allow rapid response when Japanese forces were detected. It was far enough from the expected Japanese approach route to avoid premature detection by Japanese scout planes. It was positioned to allow American carriers to strike the Japanese fleet from an unexpected direction. The American force consisted of 3 carriers, 8 cruisers, 15 destroyers, and approximately 233 aircraft. Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher commanded the overall force from Yorktown. Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance commanded Task Force 16, consisting of Enterprise and Hornet. Both men understood they were outnumbered. Japanese intelligence suggested the enemy had 4 fleet carriers, 2 light carriers, multiple battleship divisions, and over 248 carrier aircraft. But the Americans had 2 crucial advantages. They knew when the Japanese would arrive, and they knew where the Japanese would be. On June 3rd, a PBY Catalina patrol bomber spotted Japanese ships 600 miles southwest of Midway. The pilot reported transports and escort vessels heading northeast. This was the invasion force, approaching from exactly the direction Rochefort had predicted. But these were not the carriers. The carriers would approach from the northwest, striking Midway from a different direction to achieve surprise. Fletcher ordered his force to maintain position and wait. The morning of June 4th began before dawn. At 05:53, radar at Midway detected incoming aircraft approximately 100 miles out. Minutes later, the radar plot showed dozens of aircraft approaching from the northwest. At 05:52, a PBY Catalina sighted the Japanese carrier force and transmitted a contact report with position, course, and speed. The report reached Fletcher at 0600. He immediately ordered all 3 American carriers to launch everything they had. The Japanese attack on Midway began at 0630. Bombs hit fuel storage tanks, the seaplane hangar, and the powerhouse. Marine fighters intercepted the attacking force but were overwhelmed by Japanese Zeros. 15 of 26 Marine fighters were shot down. The survivors landed with empty ammunition and shot-up aircraft. Midway's facilities were damaged, but not destroyed. The airfield remained operational. More importantly, the Japanese had revealed their position. At 0700, Enterprise began launching aircraft. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, the Air Group commander, led the strike. McCluskey had 33 SBD Dauntless dive bombers under his command. 16 came from Bombing Squadron 6. 16 came from Scouting Squadron 6. McCluskey flew the 33rd Aircraft as formation leader. The plan called for a coordinated attack with torpedo bombers and fighters, but the launch had been rushed. Aircraft departed in groups rather than as a unified force. The torpedo bombers went one direction, the fighters went another. McCluskey's dive bombers went a third direction. The careful coordination that American doctrine required had broken down under the pressure of launching quickly. McCluskey's navigation was based on the PBY's contact report from 0552. The report gave a position, course, and speed. McCluskey calculated an intercept point and headed southwest. At 0920, he reached the calculated position. There was nothing there. Empty ocean. Clear sky. No Japanese fleet. McCluskey checked his navigation. His chart was a small paper document strapped to his thigh. His instruments consisted of a magnetic compass and an airspeed indicator. Over-water navigation in 1942 was an art, not a science. Small errors accumulated. Wind drift affected course. Visibility varied. McCluskey had to decide: turn back toward Enterprise or keep searching. His fuel gauge showed he was burning reserves. In another 30 minutes, he would reach the point of no return. If he had not found the Japanese by then, he would have to turn back or risk running out of fuel before reaching his carrier. Some of his pilots were already turning back. 3 aircraft had dropped out with engine trouble earlier. More would drop out if he kept searching. But if McCluskey turned back now without finding the enemy, the entire mission would be wasted. All those torpedo bomber crews who had died would have died for nothing. McCluskey made his decision. He would search southwest for 15 more minutes. If he found nothing, he would execute a box search pattern to the north. His reasoning was logical. If the Japanese carriers had passed the intercept point and were now south of his position, the PBY patrol planes from Midway would have spotted them and reported their position. Since there had been no reports of Japanese carriers to the south, they must be to the north. Something must have delayed them or changed their course. McCluskey's reasoning was exactly correct. The Japanese carriers had been forced to maneuver repeatedly during the morning. American torpedo bombers from Midway had attacked at 0710. Japanese carriers turned hard to avoid torpedoes. B-26 Marauder bombers from Midway attacked at 0715, more evasive maneuvers. American torpedo bombers from Hornet attacked at 0920. Additional maneuvering. Each evasive turn slowed the Japanese advance toward Midway. Then, at 0917, Admiral Nagumo received a report that American carriers were in the area. He immediately turned his entire fleet 90 degrees to the left, onto a northeasterly heading. He was closing the distance to the American task forces, so his own aircraft could strike them. At 0955, McCluskey spotted a Japanese destroyer making high speed to the northeast. The destroyer was Arashi. Earlier that morning, the American submarine Nautilus had attempted to attack the Japanese carrier force. Arashi had been detached to depth charge the submarine. Now Arashi was rushing to rejoin the main fleet. McCluskey assumed the destroyer must be heading toward the carriers. He ordered his 31 remaining dive bombers to follow Arashi's heading. At 10:15, McCluskey saw ship wakes on the horizon. 4 large wakes, the distinctive pattern of heavy ships traveling in formation at high speed. The Japanese carriers. McCluskey checked his altitude, 19,000 feet. Perfect position for a dive bombing attack. Below him, the 4 Japanese carriers were in a rough box formation. Kaga and Akagi were closest. Hiryu and Soryu were farther away. Flight decks on all 4 carriers were crowded with aircraft. Deck crews were preparing for launch. Fuel lines were connected. Ordnance carts were positioned near aircraft. Every carrier was at maximum vulnerability. McCluskey gave the attack order at 10:22. His formation split into 2 groups. Both groups dove toward the 2 nearest carriers, Kaga and Akagi. According to American dive bombing doctrine, the 2 squadrons should have attacked separate carriers to spread the damage. But in the confusion and excitement of the dive, both squadrons converged on Kaga. Lieutenant Richard Best, commanding Bombing Squadron 6, recognized the error halfway through his dive. At 10,000 feet, with his aircraft accelerating toward 400 miles per hour, Best made a split-second decision. He pulled out of his dive, signaled his 2 wingmen, and redirected toward Akagi. The first bomb hit Kaga at 10:22. The bomb was a 1,000-pound semi-armor-piercing weapon dropped from 14,000 feet. It struck the flight deck just forward of the midships elevator. The bomb penetrated through the wooden flight deck, through the hangar deck below, and exploded in a berthing compartment. The explosion was devastating, but not immediately fatal. What made it catastrophic was what happened next. Secondary explosions began almost immediately. Armed aircraft in the hangar deck had been fueled and loaded with bombs and torpedoes. The initial explosion ignited aviation fuel. The fires spread to munitions. Within minutes, Kaga's entire hangar deck was an inferno. Additional bombs struck the carrier over the next 90 seconds. One hit amidships, another hit near the stern. Each bomb added more fire, more explosions, more damage. By 10:24, Kaga was doomed. Best's 3 aircraft attacked Akagi simultaneously. Best's bomb struck almost exactly amidships, just aft of the middle elevator. Like the bomb that hit Kaga, this weapon penetrated to the hangar deck. The explosion ignited fuel vapor from aircraft being serviced. A massive secondary explosion erupted through the flight deck. One of Best's wingmen scored a near miss that disabled Akagi's rudder. The carrier began turning in circles, out of control. Fires consumed the hangar deck. Ammunition explosions killed damage control parties. By 10:46, Akagi's captain ordered abandon ship. At almost the same moment, dive bombers from Yorktown attacked the carrier Soryu. Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie led 17 SBD Dauntless dive bombers in a textbook attack. 3 bombs hit Soryu in rapid succession. All 3 penetrated to the hangar deck. All 3 triggered the same catastrophic secondary explosions that had doomed Kaga and Akagi. Soryu was abandoned at 10:45. 3 Japanese carriers destroyed in approximately 4 minutes. From 10:22 to 10:26, the entire strategic balance of the Pacific War shifted. Japan had entered the battle with 4 of the 6 carriers that attacked Pearl Harbor. By 10:30, 3 of those 4 were burning wrecks. The 4th carrier, Hiryu, managed to launch 2 strikes against Yorktown, before being located and destroyed by Enterprise dive bombers at 1700 hours that afternoon. The popular narrative describes these as the 5 fatal minutes when Japan was moments away from launching its own strike. Modern scholarship has debunked this dramatic claim. According to comprehensive research by Jonathan Parshall and Anthony Tully in their authoritative work, Shattered Sword, published in 2005, the Japanese carrier decks at 10:25 were mostly empty. Strike aircraft were still in the hangars being rearmed and refueled. Admiral Nagumo was approximately 30 to 45 minutes from being ready to launch his attack, not 5 minutes. The coincidental timing of the American attack was real and fortunate. But the idea that Japan was seconds from victory is a myth that originated from inaccurate post-war Japanese accounts, particularly those of Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, whose testimony has been thoroughly discredited by modern historians. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stood on the bridge of the light cruiser Nagara and watched his carriers burn. He had commanded these ships and their crews through every major operation since Pearl Harbor. He had struck British forces at Ceylon. He had raided Darwin. He had attacked Midway. For 6 months, his carriers had been invincible. Now, in 4 minutes, everything had collapsed. Nagumo could not comprehend what had happened. American torpedo attacks all morning had been ineffective. 41 torpedo bombers destroyed without achieving a single hit. Then American dive bombers appeared at precisely the worst possible moment. How had they known when to attack? How had they coordinated from multiple carriers without radio communication that Japanese interceptors could detect? How had they found the fleet after Japanese evasive maneuvers had changed course and position? Nagumo did not know about Station Hypo. He did not know about Commander Rochefort. He did not know that Americans had been reading Japanese naval messages for months. He did not know about the water shortage deception. He did not know that Admiral Nimitz had positioned American carriers based on intelligence that revealed Japanese plans down to the day and hour of attack. Nagumo assumed American success was due to luck. He was wrong. American success was due to intelligence, preparation, and a willingness to take calculated risks based on incomplete information. Admiral Yamamoto received news of the disaster at 11:30 that morning. He was aboard his flagship Yamato, sailing 600 miles west of the carrier battle. Yamamoto had designed the Midway operation as a complex multi-front attack. Forces were divided into multiple groups spread across thousands of miles of ocean. The plan depended on deception, surprise, and the assumption that Americans would react slowly and conventionally. Now the plan was collapsing. 3 carriers sunk, 1 carrier damaged. American carriers still operational and striking at will. The invasion of Midway was impossible without carrier air support. Yamamoto tried to salvage something from the disaster. He ordered forces from the Aleutian operation to head south. He ordered his battleship formation to close for a night surface engagement. Japanese battleships outnumbered and outgunned American surface forces. A night battle might turn defeat into victory. But American carriers refused to cooperate. They withdrew to the east, maintaining distance, refusing to be drawn into a surface engagement where Japanese advantages in gunnery and night fighting would dominate. By midnight on June 5th, Yamamoto accepted reality. The operation had failed. He ordered a general withdrawal toward Japan. The Battle of Midway cost Japan 4 fleet carriers, 1 heavy cruiser, 248 aircraft, and 3,057 personnel killed. The aviator losses included 110 experienced carrier pilots and aircrew, men who had accumulated thousands of flight hours and years of training. These losses were significant, but not immediately catastrophic to Japan's pilot reserves. The Japanese Naval Air Training Program could graduate enough new pilots to fill the empty cockpits, but the new pilots would have far less training than the men they replaced. The veterans lost at Midway had flown combat missions since December 1941. Their replacements would enter combat with minimal experience. The institutional knowledge and combat effectiveness of Japanese carrier aviation had been permanently degraded. American losses were 1 carrier, 1 destroyer, approximately 150 aircraft, and 307 personnel killed. Yorktown, crippled by Japanese air attacks on June 4th, was torpedoed by the Japanese submarine I-168 on June 6th. The destroyer, Hamon, alongside Yorktown, assisting with damage control, was also torpedoed and sank rapidly. Yorktown remained afloat for several more hours before finally sinking on June 7th. The casualty ratio was approximately 10-1 in favor of the United States. For the Imperial Japanese Navy, which had not lost a major battle in over 300 years, this was psychologically shattering. Japanese military culture emphasized honor, courage, and spiritual superiority over material factors. Midway demonstrated that honor and courage were insufficient against an enemy with better intelligence, better technology, and superior industrial capacity. What changed after Midway was not just the balance of forces but the balance of confidence. Before Midway, Japanese commanders planned operations assuming American responses would be slow, poorly coordinated, and tactically predictable. After Midway, those assumptions were untenable. Americans had demonstrated operational security good enough to prevent Japanese intelligence from detecting carrier movements. Americans had demonstrated code-breaking capabilities, sophisticated enough to read Japanese operational plans. Americans had demonstrated tactical coordination good enough to launch simultaneous strikes from multiple carriers. Most importantly, Americans had demonstrated a willingness to accept devastating casualties in order to achieve victory. The torpedo squadrons had been annihilated, but their sacrifice had drawn Japanese fighters down to sea level, leaving the carriers vulnerable when dive bombers arrived. Japanese military leadership struggled to understand what had happened. Admiral Matome Ugaki, who served as Chief of Staff to Yamamoto, maintained a detailed personal diary throughout the war. His entries for early June 1942 reveal the psychological impact of Midway. On June 5th, immediately after the battle, Ugaki attributed the defeat to insufficient reconnaissance and poor tactical decisions by Nagumo. He implied that better scouting and quicker reaction would have changed the outcome. By June 7th, after more complete reports had arrived, Ugaki acknowledged that American intelligence had been far superior to Japanese expectations. By June 10th, he was writing about the need to fundamentally revise Japanese assessments of American military capabilities. Within the upper echelons of the Imperial Japanese Navy, there was remarkably little accountability for the disaster. Neither Yamamoto nor Nagumo was relieved of command. No admirals were court-martialed. No senior officers were reassigned in disgrace. The institutional response was to minimize public knowledge of the defeat while quietly implementing tactical changes. Survivors were quarantined upon return to Japan. They were forbidden to discuss the battle with anyone outside the military. Official casualty reports were falsified. The Japanese public learned nothing about Midway for years. The cover-up was so successful that many Japanese civilians did not learn about the battle until after the war ended in 1945. On June 15, 1942, Vice Admiral Nagumo's staff began drafting new carrier doctrine. The project resulted in a tactical manual issued in late July. The document formally recognized, for the first time in Japanese naval doctrine, that aircraft carriers were the decisive weapon of modern naval warfare. All other surface forces, including battleships, would support carrier operations rather than the reverse. This represented a revolutionary change in Japanese naval thinking. For decades, Japanese naval doctrine had centered on battleships as the ultimate arbiter of naval combat. The decisive battle that would win the war would be fought by battleship gun lines, with carriers providing supporting strikes. Midway proved that doctrine was obsolete, but the recognition came too late. Japan had already lost its most experienced carrier crews and its most modern carriers. Japanese operational doctrine also changed, though not always effectively. Yamamoto had favored dispersed formations with forces spread across vast ocean areas. The theory was that dispersion would confuse American intelligence and allow Japanese forces to concentrate rapidly when the enemy was located. Midway proved that dispersion left isolated forces vulnerable to concentrated American attacks. Yet, Japanese commanders continued using dispersed formations in subsequent battles. At the Eastern Solomons in August 1942, Japanese forces were again divided into multiple groups. At Santa Cruz in October 1942, the same pattern repeated. Only after multiple defeats did Japanese doctrine shift toward concentration of forces. The most significant change was in Japanese attitudes toward American capabilities. Before Midway, Japanese tactical training emphasized American weaknesses. American pilots were taught to be inferior in skill and motivation. American aircraft were taught to be inferior in performance and capability. American tactics were taught to be predictable and unimaginative. After Midway, these teachings became impossible to sustain. American dive bomber pilots had pressed attacks through intense anti-aircraft fire and determined fighter opposition. They had achieved approximately 15% hit rates, 3 times the peacetime training standard. They had demonstrated coolness under fire and tactical flexibility. Japanese pilots who survived Midway reported that American tactics were aggressive, well-coordinated, and effective. In August 1942, Japanese forces attempted to recapture Guadalcanal. The operation required naval support to transport troops and supplies. When American and Japanese carrier forces clashed at the Eastern Solomons on August 24, Japanese pilots expected to face the same obsolete Devastator torpedo bombers they had massacred at Midway. Instead, they encountered Grumman TBF Avenger torpedo bombers, which were faster, better armed, and more survivable than the Devastators. Japanese after-action reports noted the change and warned that American forces were adapting more rapidly than anticipated. By October 1942, Japanese naval intelligence was distributing assessments that explicitly warned commanders about underestimating American capabilities. One report, circulated to all carrier division commanders, stated that American pilots demonstrated training levels equivalent to Japanese pilots, and that American carrier operations showed sophisticated coordination and tactical competence. The report recommended increased combat air patrols, improved radar coverage, better fighter direction, and more aggressive damage control procedures. These recommendations were tactically sound, but Japanese industry lacked the capacity to produce the radar systems, radio equipment, and damage control equipment needed to implement them effectively. The strategic initiative in the Pacific shifted to the United States after Midway. On August 7, 1942, American forces landed on Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands. This marked the first major American offensive operation of the Pacific War. Japanese commanders expected to defeat the landing quickly and drive American forces back into the sea. Instead, fighting continued for 6 brutal months. The campaign consumed Japanese resources at an unsustainable rate. The Imperial Japanese Navy lost 2 battleships, 4 cruisers, 11 destroyers, and 6 submarines, attempting to support operations on Guadalcanal. American losses were also severe: 2 carriers, 8 cruisers, and 14 destroyers. But American industry could replace losses within months. Japanese industry required years to build equivalent replacements. Admiral Yamamoto recognized that Japan was losing a war of attrition that it could never win. In April 1943, he planned a morale-boosting tour of forward bases in the Solomon Islands. The visit was intended to demonstrate to frontline troops that senior leadership understood their sacrifices and valued their service. Yamamoto's itinerary was transmitted to forward commanders via radio using the JN-25B code. Station Hypo intercepted the transmission. Commander Rochefort's successor at Station Hypo decrypted the message. It contained Yamamoto's complete schedule: departure time from Rabaul, arrival time at Bougainville, aircraft type, escort composition, and flight path. The intelligence was passed to Admiral Nimitz. Nimitz faced a difficult decision. Yamamoto was Japan's most capable naval strategist. Killing him would damage Japanese command effectiveness, but assassinating Yamamoto would also reveal that Americans could read Japanese codes. If Japan realized JN-25B was compromised, they would change their entire code system. Station Hypo would lose its window into Japanese planning. Nimitz had to weigh tactical advantage against strategic intelligence. He authorized the mission. On April 18, 1943, 16 P-38 Lightning fighters from Kukum Field on Guadalcanal intercepted Yamamoto's transport over Bougainville. The engagement lasted less than 5 minutes. Yamamoto's aircraft was shot down. He died instantly. Japan had lost its most experienced naval commander. The loss was not militarily decisive, but it was psychologically devastating. Yamamoto had been the architect of Japanese naval strategy since the late 1930s. His death removed the one senior officer who truly understood both Japanese capabilities and American potential. Commander Joseph Rochefort received no recognition for his role in the Midway victory. In fact, he was punished for his success. Rochefort's direct reporting to Admiral Nimitz had bypassed the official chain of command and violated Washington's bureaucratic protocols. Captain John Redman, who directed the Navy's code section in Washington, resented Rochefort's independence and his close relationship with Nimitz. Redman lobbied aggressively to have Rochefort removed from Station Hypo. In late October 1942, Rochefort received orders transferring him from Hawaii. Initially, he was assigned to the Western Sea Frontier Command in San Francisco, a staff position with no intelligence responsibilities. In August 1943, he was assigned to command a floating dry dock, a dead-end assignment typically given to officers being eased toward retirement. Rochefort spent the remainder of the war in administrative positions, far from combat operations and intelligence work. He received the Legion of Merit in 1945, but Admiral King personally objected even to that modest recognition. King believed Rochefort had been insubordinate and had bypassed proper command channels. The fact that Rochefort's intelligence had won the Battle of Midway was, in King's view, irrelevant to questions of military discipline and proper procedure. The Distinguished Service Medal was announced for Rochefort in 1985, 9 years after his death. President Reagan formally presented the medal to Rochefort's children on May 30, 1986. The following year, Rochefort received a posthumous Presidential Medal of Freedom. Both awards came decades too late to matter to Rochefort himself, who died in 1976, believing his contributions had been ignored and undervalued by the Navy he had served for over 4 decades. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey survived the Battle of Midway, but was severely wounded during his attack. As he pulled out of his dive after bombing Kaga, 2 Japanese Zero fighters attacked his aircraft from behind. The Zeros put 52 bullet holes through McCluskey's Dauntless. 1 bullet struck McCluskey in the shoulder, passing through muscle and narrowly missing his lung. His rear seat gunner, Arm 1C Walter Chokalusek, shot down one of the attacking Zeros. McCluskey managed to fly his damaged aircraft back to Enterprise, landing with less than 5 gallons of fuel remaining. 10 other aircraft from his squadrons ran out of fuel and ditched in the ocean. Their crews were never found. McCluskey received the Navy Cross for his actions at Midway. He later commanded the escort carrier Corregidor during operations in the Atlantic and Pacific. After the war, he served in various staff positions and as a naval attaché before retiring as a rear admiral in 1956. He died on June 27, 1976, at age 74. Admiral Nimitz wrote in his after-action report that McCluskey's decision to continue searching for the Japanese fleet, despite low fuel and no confirmed enemy position, and his judgment about where the enemy must be, had decided the fate of the American carrier task force and determined the outcome of the battle. Without McCluskey's persistence and tactical intuition, American dive bombers would never have found the Japanese carriers. Lieutenant Richard Best, who commanded Bombing Squadron 6 during the attack, achieved the unique distinction of scoring confirmed hits on 2 enemy carriers in a single day. Best was one of only 4 pilots in the entire US Navy to achieve multiple carrier kills at Midway. But Best paid a terrible price for his success. During his dive on Akagi, Best breathed caustic soda lime contaminated oxygen from a defective canister in his aircraft's emergency oxygen system. The contamination permanently damaged his lungs and led to tuberculosis. Best was hospitalized shortly after Midway and never flew in combat again. He was medically retired on March 1, 1944, at age 33. Best received the Navy Cross for his actions at Midway. He lived until October 28, 2001. During his later years, Best became an active participant in Midway commemorative events and historical research. He worked with historians to ensure accurate accounts of the battle and to correct myths and inaccuracies that had accumulated over decades. Best was particularly insistent about correcting the false narrative of the 5 fatal minutes, explaining to multiple interviewers and researchers that Japanese carriers were nowhere near ready to launch when American dive bombers struck. Admiral Chester Nimitz remained commander of the Pacific Fleet throughout the war. He directed American strategy across the entire Pacific theater, coordinating Army, Navy, and Marine Corps operations over millions of square miles of ocean. Under Nimitz's command, American forces executed the island-hopping campaign that bypassed Japanese strongpoints and seized strategically vital locations. Nimitz personally selected target islands, allocated resources, and approved operational plans. His strategic vision shaped the entire Pacific campaign. On September 2, 1945, Nimitz signed the Japanese surrender document aboard the battleship Missouri in Tokyo Bay. He consistently credited intelligence, particularly the work of Station Hypo, as the decisive factor in American victory. Without code-breaking, Nimitz stated publicly on multiple occasions, the Midway battle would have been lost, and the war would have lasted years longer with far higher casualties. Admiral Raymond Spruance, who commanded Task Force 16 at Midway, went on to become one of the war's most successful commanders. Spruance planned and led the Central Pacific Campaign, including the assaults on Tarawa, Kwajalein, Saipan, and Iwo Jima. His meticulous planning and careful execution contrasted with the more aggressive style of Admiral Halsey, but Spruance's approach resulted in consistent victories with manageable casualties. Spruance became Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet in November 1945, though he held the position only briefly in the immediate post-war period. He retired from active duty in 1948 and later served as president of the Naval War College and ambassador to the Philippines. Spruance consistently identified Midway as the turning point that made all subsequent American victories possible. The Battle of Midway fundamentally altered how both sides viewed each other and themselves. Japan entered the battle, assuming that cultural superiority, spiritual dedication, and tactical excellence would overcome American material advantages. Japanese commanders believed their pilots were better trained, their equipment was superior, and their fighting spirit was unconquerable. These beliefs had been reinforced by 6 months of unbroken victory. Midway shattered those beliefs. Americans had demonstrated that they could match Japanese skill, courage, and determination, while also bringing superior intelligence, industrial capacity, and adaptive tactics to bear. The United States entered Midway, knowing it was outnumbered and outgunned, but confident that intelligence and preparation could overcome material disadvantages. American commanders gambled that code-breaking would provide accurate intelligence about Japanese plans. They wagered that American pilots, despite limited combat experience, could execute the complex coordinated attacks that doctrine required. They accepted that torpedo squadrons would likely be annihilated, but believed their sacrifice would create opportunities for dive bombers. All of these gambles paid off. American confidence was validated. The lesson of Midway transcends the specific details of carrier aviation, dive bombing tactics, and code-breaking procedures. The fundamental lesson is about information as the ultimate force multiplier. The side that knew where the enemy was, when the enemy would arrive, and what the enemy planned to do held an insurmountable advantage. Commander Joseph Rochefort and his team at Station Hypo provided that information. They penetrated codes that Japanese cryptographers believed were unbreakable. They extracted intelligence that Japanese commanders assumed was secure. They turned Japanese confidence into vulnerability. Japanese admirals stopped underestimating American sailors because Midway proved that underestimation was fatal. American cryptanalysts were not inferior. American pilots were not lacking in skill or motivation. American commanders were not slow, predictable, or conventional. American industrial capacity was not a distant theoretical advantage but an immediate practical reality. Every assumption that had guided Japanese planning since Pearl Harbor was proven wrong in 4 minutes of dive-bombing attacks on the morning of June 4, 1942. The consequences of those wrong assumptions were measured in sunken carriers, dead sailors, lost aircraft, and a strategic initiative that Japan would never recover. This is how wars actually turn, not through predetermined destiny or inevitable industrial supremacy, but through intelligence officers working in windowless basements, pilots making life-or-death decisions over empty ocean, torpedo bomber crews flying into certain death to create tactical opportunities, dive bomber pilots keeping faith when the enemy is nowhere to be found, and commanders willing to gamble everything on incomplete intelligence and calculated risk. Midway was won by men like Rochefort, who broke the codes, by men like McCluskey, who kept searching, by men like Best, who improvised under pressure, by men like Waldron and Massey, who led their crews into annihilation so that others might succeed, by men who understood that being underestimated was an advantage, not an insult. Japan never recovered from Midway. From June 1942 forward, every carrier battle was defensive, every strategic decision was reactive, every resource allocation was constrained. The offensive that began at Pearl Harbor ended in the waters northwest of Midway Atoll, and it ended because one side understood the other far better than the other understood itself. If you found this story compelling, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each one matters. Each one deserves to be remembered. Leave a comment below telling us where you are watching from. Our community spans from Texas to Tasmania, from veterans to history enthusiasts. You are part of something special here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive.